when you say amino acid oxidation, are you, just to break this down for myself and the listener, are you saying that beyond what is being used within muscle protein synthesis, amino acids are, is it converted to glucose and then used to produce energy? Is that amino acid oxidation?
That can be one fate. There's depending on the amino acid you're interested in. A lot of times in muscle physiology and protein nutrition, we study leucine oxidation, but with Luc Van Loon, who I worked for as a postdoc, just a prolific researcher and protein metabolism as well. So I've been fortunate enough not to only work with Stu Phillips, but also Luc Van Loon. Both are huge influences on my life. But when I was over with Luc, he would do a lot of phenylalanine hydroxylation. Okay. But a lot of times over here, and Stu as well, we normally look at leucine oxidation because it's primarily oxidized in your skeletal muscle. So what you're going to do is take those carbon skeletons out of that molecule, right? You got to get rid of that nitrogen, but you're going to take those carbon skeletons and make acetyl-CoA from it, and then acetyl-CoA is going to enter the Krebs cycle and follow the same metabolic fate as if you're making acetyl-CoA from fats or glucose. So depending on what amino acid you're looking at, I mean, you were referencing, alanine is a good gluconeogenic precursor, which will be turned into new glucose in your liver. So, but a lot of times, a lot of people in nutrition, we're interested in leucine oxidation, which is going to take place in your skeletal muscle. What other amino acids will be used in different ways. So it really depends on which amino acid you're viewing through. But oxidation, you can just sort of make it. You're not using it for protein accretion. You're using it for some other metabolic output.
And what's the problem with that? So you kind of alluded to the fact that the amount of amino acid oxidation, so the amount of amino acids that could go down this path of gluconeogenesis, be converted to glucose or other pathways, so not being used for muscle protein synthesis, could differ between a kind of protein isolate, so having a whey protein shake or a pea protein shake versus eating protein in food. What's the downside of having that, say, 30 or 40 grams of protein from a protein shake and having an increase in amino acid oxidation?
Yeah. So let me make this clear. There doesn't appear to be any detrimental impact on health as far as I can see. Meaning, if I'm routinely stimulating a lot of oxidation, it's not negative on your kidney. It's not in healthy individuals, negative on bone health. So the only thing I think the problem is that when you're routinely stimulating these oxidative pathways, you're creating a less efficient system. And this is some work from Dan Moore up in Toronto, who uses a pretty cool amino acid technique to determine protein requirements. But what he's shown is these individuals that are chronically eating high protein, stimulating oxidative pathways, have created an inefficient system, meaning they burn more of the amino acids coming in, and thereby elevating their protein requirements, because your system has got used to having protein in excess. It's used to trying to eliminate all that extra nitrogen in the system, that you've upregulated this and you become less efficient. He's shown that can do upregulate proteolytic and oxidative pathways. But the other negative consequence of generally eating high protein is that you start to displace other nutrients. Like weightlifters are notorious for going big protein and sometimes not getting enough carbohydrates. And so the other aspect of that is your protein requirements are going to be elevated when you don't have a glycogen, fully repleted muscle glycogen. You're also going to elevate your protein requirements. So I guess the short end is a lot of these higher protein recommendations for weightlifters are probably due to the fact that they're created an inefficient system. Chronically eating high protein upregulates proteolytic systems, can displace other nutrients, and also Luc Van Loon has some nice data showing that You also get higher splanchnic extraction rates, meaning your gut steals more of those amino acids, just again because you're eating in excess. So normally, it takes about 2 weeks to adapt down. Um, so it's not like you can't come back from, once you go high protein, you got to stay high protein. You can certainly come back, but you're going to be inefficient for at least 2 weeks after trying to come back to a more sane amount, or a more normal amount, or a more optimal amount, if you want to use that word. But again, there's nothing wrong with eating maximally. It's fine. You just not being very clever with your food protein is the only thing. There's better ways to eat.
Right. Do we see in the literature, though, that at sort of 1.6 grams per kilogram, let's take the lower end of that range that's often quoted, 1.6 to 2.2, do we see that at that level compared to, say, 1.2 grams per kilogram, that outcomes like muscle protein synthesis and hypertrophy are significantly greater? Or is that comparison usually made between like 1.6 grams and zero point 0.8 grams?
Okay, so this is something we've been advocating for a long time as protein nutrition researchers. It's what needs to happen is randomized a large scale randomized clinically controlled trial to answer this question, right? That's going to take a lot of money and organized effort to do that. So what we're leaning on now are certainly, like meta-analyses, okay? Which, you know, your meta-analysis is only as good as the studies that go into it. Let's put it that way. And I would say it's probably improving now, but in the exercise field, you have exercise physiologists who are not registered dietitians trying to do dietary recalls. Okay. So the information going into these meta analyses are probably not ideal. All right. Because exercise physiologists are not trained to do that sort of work. That's why it requires a multidisciplinary team to do this. And that's why I work a lot with registered dietitians to make sure I'm collecting the best data. And the other thing is, a lot of times, studies going into these meta-analysis looked at protein intake at the beginning and at the end. They didn't pay attention to what's going on here, right? And so they're just not reliable. So some of the information going into this data is just the best we have. We can only make recommendations on what we have. So my point is, we can improve on that, but that would take a lot of money, a large scale coordinated effort. I don't know where I was going with that. What was the question?
I mean, I think you're raising some interesting points here, and kind of what I'm hearing from you is that you're suggesting if you're not efficient at using protein, then sure, you might require this 1.6 to 2.2 grams to get the best outcomes. But it is possible to become more efficient at utilizing amino acids such that your daily requirement is actually lower because less of that amino acid is being oxidized. More of it is being used for muscle protein synthesis. So my question to you is, if someone's listening and thinking, oh, okay, so I'm hearing kind of for the first time here that maybe I don't need to eat as much protein as I thought, how can they kind of optimize to make sure that they are utilizing more of the protein that they're consuming such that they can actually just consume less total protein?
I don't think 1.6. That's a maximizing number. And again, the reason there's nothing wrong with doing that. I want to make that clear. That's just to make things simple for people, which is really important when you got a hectic lifestyle. You're just eating excess, you're good, right? Now, if you want to be more thoughtful, and I wouldn't say more efficient, it's just normal eating patterns, right? It's not really becoming more efficient. It's just how our recommendations are designed, per se. So the things I would do if you're trying to optimize your protein intake, I do a lot of work trying to leverage food matrix effects, right, to make better use of our protein nutrition. We're finding right now, I think a lipid-rich food matrix, so a protein-dense and lipid-rich food matrix is very good for our muscles. Um, we're trying to understand the mechanism behind why these lipids are helping to potentiate the use of dietary amino acids. It could just be as simply as that it's giving a more moderate profile, right? But I think there's something with these lipids and the mitochondria efficiency would be my guess.
Is there a certain type of lipid? Are we talking about like saturated fats, short chain fatty acids, medium chain, long chain? Are we talking about uh, monounsaturated, polyunsaturated?
Sure, I know what you're saying. Not sure. I mean, we got multiple studies going on now that's doing different lipid manipulations to sort of pinpoint that question. Okay, I don't have the answer. We've seen benefits from all sorts of fats. All right, um, I I think you. I wish we could pin it on one thing because that would make life so much easier, right? If we could identify a fat that was particularly anabolic or particularly helpful for amino acids, then we could just simply fortify the foods with that fat, right? I think nature is too clever for us, right? I think it's I don't know. I don't have the answer to that. It's an interesting point. It's a good question. I think I need about another 2 years to get that a better handle on that question. Now, keep in mind the other point I want to make is that food. If you ever look at the postprandial release from isolated protein powders versus food, and this is factored into this optimal question, optimal versus maximal. All right. So when you eat, I'll just use whey protein because it's so dominant, right? If you look at the amino acid profiles after you eat whey protein, um, it's fast, right? It you see rates, time to peak amino acid concentrations at about 60 to 90 minutes. Then it clears out of your gut. It's back down to baseline by 3 hours, right? Super fast. Food is very different. It doesn't peak to 2 hours, and it's released for at least, 5, 6, 7 hours during the postprandial period, right? So very different profiles is going to dictate how we utilize that food. Okay. Now it depends on what is your goal. You've been focused on weightlifters, you know. So I think a weightlifter, if they have the ability to go home and eat a food first approach, and what I mean by that is focus their diet on a whole foods. That's the way to go. I don't think they need whey protein in their life, right? But keep in mind, I understand that travel schedules and things, it's convenient, but that's not a necessity. Now, I think endurance athletes are a little different.
Can I quickly
And that
just
could be,
ask you one question
yeah.
before we get to the endurance athletes there? So, is that recommendation of yours based on the fact that for hypertrophy, it would be better to have the protein kind of slowly absorbed into circulation versus that kind of rapid in and out that occurs with the protein isolation?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, it's so fast. I mean, it's this window, the only reason you could rationalize why eating whey protein is beneficial would be based on the notion that there's a small window of anabolic potential that you need to get your food into circulation, right? A weightlifter doesn't really exist. So when the beauty of weightlifting is that it's fundamentally anabolic, causes a large rise in protein synthesis that's sustained throughout a prolonged recovery period. So anytime you eat during that post-exercise window, you're going to see that synergy between food and exercise, right? And so there's nothing magical about eating 1 hour after your bout. You can go home, like, and eat a nice protein dense whole food meal and get just as much hypertrophy as you would if you were incorporating a lot of whey protein powders into your life. Now, sometimes when you're dealing with athletes, you need to overstress. If you take, it all depends who you're talking to. If you take If you tell an athlete, okay, go home, eat some food, timing's not important, they might not eat protein, and they just might not even worry about it, right? So sometimes as a practitioner, you kind of overstress the protein, like eat this right after your weightlifting bout because now they've consumed this protein in your hands and they're covered, right? As opposed to relying on them to go home. Most of us, though, are not top tier athletes. Most of us are just normal humans that are not trying to make money off of sport. So again, it's a different scenarios, but most of us have time to go home and eat a meal, and you do not gain any um, greater anabolic potential from inducing that whey protein or eating that whey protein immediately after that bout.
If someone is having a protein isolate, coming back to this kind of lipid effect that you mentioned before. So what I heard was that fats may be affecting amino acids and how they influence muscle protein synthesis. If you were having a protein shake, would it be helpful to add some form of fats to that?
No, this is an interesting question you bring up. So when I was over with Luke Van Loon, we had a big interest. So obviously, dairy's big everywhere, but particularly in the Netherlands. Um, so we were sort of. I spent a lot of my postdoc trying to make casein more anabolic. It's a large proportion of milk protein, right? When you look at whey, the ratio of whey to casein, the major milk protein fractions, it's 20%, 80%. All right. So I was tasked, or lab as part of a group, to try to make casein more anabolic. And so what we did was we added lipids to casein. All right. And what we found was simply adding dairy lipids to casein did not potentiate it. Okay. Did not make better use of those amino acids. That's why when we were running some of our whole food matrix questions here, was even more interesting because that anabolic potential seemed to only stick provided we ate the protein within its natural lipid matrix. Okay, so if you deconstruct the matrix, you lose that anabolic potential. When you keep it intact within its normal matrix, that's where we see the greater anabolic potential. It's interesting. We've been running a lot of studies trying to understand what is so unique about this food matrix, right? And I'm viewing the food matrix through nutrient interactions. So food matrix effects can also be structural in nature. You can manipulate a food matrix by taking a piece of steak and mincing it up, right? So that would be manipulating the food matrix. So mincing up a piece of steak increases its digestibility. But what I'm talking about now is the food matrix from the perspective of nutrient interactions. And there's something with these lipids, and simply, as you alluded to, simply taking whey protein, adding fat, it doesn't appear to help it. You got to eat it within its intact matrix. I mean, it's cool. I mean, it's an interesting finding.
It kind of hints at this necessity for more studies to use whole food forms of protein in protein feeding because much of the research is protein isolates, right?
Well, I mean, yes, I would say, yeah, 100%. I mean, all our studies, I think that paradigm is changing. You got to understand, the field is, you're going to start off anything from a very reductionist or a bottoms up approach. So, some of the original work showed us that the essential amino acids are the major drivers of protein synthesis and net protein balance. And then you shifted to, start to do isolated foods, whey, soy, casein, right? So now we're up to probably to the food level. And then the next step is to do the meal combinations. And Luke Van Loon, all of us are starting to move in that direction. I sort of started this push with Luke, um, doing some meat versus milk comparisons, and then when I got to Illinois, I started to pursue this further. So you'll see a lot more of this coming out. But now, Simon, I want to allude to the fact, like the problem, these food matrix effects are probably only relevant when you're eating more optimal or lower amounts of food protein. So if you're eating 30 grams of or 30 grams of protein in a meal, you're sort of overriding the system. The food matrix effects are probably irrelevant. Food matrix effects are probably only relevant when you're eating closer to our recommendations, or closer to 15 to 20 grams of protein in a meal. So again, comes down to what is your goal, right? Are you trying to optimize or maximize?
Right. So if you're just getting protein everywhere you can and it's up at 1.6 or 2.2 and a bunch of that's coming from protein isolate, it's not in the food matrix, it's probably going to be okay. But if you're someone that's getting 15 to 20 grams per meal, there could be a difference between person A who's doing that from whole foods and person B that's getting that from protein isolate. So I think that's super clear, and that's actually new information, I think, certainly for me and a lot of the listeners. I think people listening that maybe follow a ketogenic diet or a high fat diet are probably quite pleased to hear what you were saying about lipids. But something that you said just before that was, if you don't have a lot of carbohydrate on board, you can have an increase in amino acid oxidation. So my question is, if someone's following a very high fat diet that's very low in carbohydrates, do they have a greater requirement for total protein?
If you're eating low carbohydrates, it doesn't necessarily increase your oxidative potential. What it does is it increases your protein requirement. So, yes, based on the work we have, people who are eating what you just said, high protein, low carb, are going to have higher protein requirements versus somebody who's eating closer to our, mixed meal recommendations. Okay, so that's a fair assessment based on the evidence we have. Absolutely.